sponsored by the National University Rail Center here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And on behalf of all of us, we thank DOT for their support of the new Rail Center. It's greatly appreciated by those of us here on campus, as well as those participating via the Internet. Let me also welcome those of you who are joining us online today, and this includes representatives from the University of Birmingham, Anacostia Rail Holdings, WSP Parsons Brinkerhoff, Parsons Transportation Group, Patriot Rail, Boise State University, Benesh Engineering, Sharma and Associates, BNSF Railway, Federal Railroad Administration, Amtrak, Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis, H.W. Lochner, the Transportation Technology Center, HDR, Patrick Engineering, Metro Transit in Minneapolis, Sistra Consulting, Quandl, and Metra in Chicago. We are very glad to have you here today, and if any of you would like to receive PDHs for your participation in the seminar today, please send an email to Emma with your information as described in the email announcement for this seminar. Positive train control, or PTC, is almost certainly the most significant advancement in railway train control technology in the past century. It is a predictive technology giving the train situational awareness that can assist in detecting upcoming conditions and is able to stop the train when needed. As such, it can virtually eliminate certain types of rail accidents. However, with that power comes complexity and very high cost. The rail industry has been engaged in its development, I should say the rail industry and government have been engaged in its development for decades, and more recently in its nationwide implementation. The Belt Railway of Chicago has a particularly challenging task because they host trains from most of the Class I railroads that enter Chicago. Consequently, all of these different railroads' PTC technology must interoperate seamlessly with that of the Belt. This presentation will outline the scope, methodology, infrastructure, and some lessons learned in accomplishing this. Our speakers today are Nick Chodorow, Chris Murphy, and Anit Shuri. Nick Chodorow has been in the technology field for 16 years and is currently the BRC's Chief Information Officer. He received his bachelor's degree from Cornell University and master's from Northwestern. He represents the Belt on several AAR and ASLRRA committees on PTC and related technologies and policies. Chris Murphy has more than a decade of experience in IT. He completed his bachelor's degree at DeVry University in Network and Communications Management, where he graduated with high honors. He joined the Belt Railway last year where he serves as their Network Systems Manager. Anit Shuri is an experienced IT leader who has been in the technology field for more than 20 years with various companies. He completed his BS degree in Civil Engineering and an MBA in International Business at Fairleigh Dickinson. He serves the Belt Railway as their PTC Program Manager. Please join me in welcoming Messrs. Chodorow, Murphy, and Shuri, who will present the William W. Hay Railroad Engineering Seminar, Implementation of PTC at the Belt Railway of Chicago and Other Non-Class I Railroads, Challenges and Solutions.
Hello, everybody. So thank you for coming. Thank you for coming online. I'm going to start a little bit with a kind of the background of the Belt, and then at that point I'll pass it off to Anit, since Anit is... there we go. Anit Shuri is our PTC PM, so he'll go more in depth with what we're actually doing. So I just went through the... So we were established in 1882. We've got about 28 miles of mainline track, which is what needs to be PTC equipped. We've got 265 miles of other track in our yards, 16 interlockings, so we're a really busy small railroad. We're at 430 employees. We're a bi-directional hump. We talked a little bit yesterday, for those of you who were able to attend one of our seminars, about kind of the network system that we're putting in order to support all of this. And then we have 29 locomotives. 5 of those are going to be PTC equipped. Most of our work with our locomotives is in the yard only and not out on the main line. So partners, as you can see, it's a big list, and our ownership is 6 of the 7 Class 1s. Each of them depart multiple trains a day out of our main yard and clearing, and just south of Midway Airport in the Chicago area. As you can see, we service those 6 owners: Amtrak, Metra, and then a bunch of short lines. So the CRL, Chicago South Shore, IHB, and then Wisconsin and Southern, which is a Waco Railroad. And this is basically a map of our main line, and then what we did is we kind of broke out each of the interlockings and then how many trains are passing it on a given day. So as you can see, it's a lot. And those numbers are in flux. This number is actually from about 1.5 years ago. But either way, it shows that PTC is a very important part of our operation going forward due to all of the mainline trains that we deal with each day. And then what we did on this slide is we tried to break it down to which railroads kind of cross at each of the interlockings or that we deal with, and just this actually helps us when it comes to kind of planning who we need to talk to about what area. With PTC, it's one of those things where there has to be a lot of communication and partnership and teamwork in order to make this work. So neat.
All right, positive train control. So my name is Aneet, and I've been with the railroad industry all of 11 months. So I'll try to do justice to the slides. As you can see, PTC is a predictive technology that detects upcoming conditions, and if the engineer does not give the right input, it's designed to shut it down. For simplicity, it's been broken into 4 segments based on their functionality or their functional characteristics. The one we talked about yesterday was the back office system. The back office system basically has the geographical information. It has such as the terrain, the trackage, critical points, mileposts, all the longitudes and latitudes, to help the train know where it's at, give it the situational awareness once it's underway. It also has another component called the consist initialization bus, which essentially has the information it gets from the business systems around the consist itself, because in order for the train to automatically brake, it needs to know how heavy it is. It needs to know where it is at. It needs to know what kind of brakes it has. So all of that it needs. So that comes from the consist server or back office system, right? So that's the back office segment that we have. Then is this wayside segment. So in order to operate PTC, the train has to have situational awareness. It needs to know what the signals are. It needs to know how the switches are aligned and so forth, because only then it'll know whether it has authority to go or it needs to stop or whatever else it needs to do. So that is the reason we had the wayside segment. The wayside segment basically communicates with the locomotive as well as the back office. So how it communicates is it communicates over 220 megahertz with the locomotive, and also it gives the same data. It tells this, for instance, the switch will say, I'm in this position to the locomotive. So the locomotive will check if it is in line with its route. It also gives the same data to the back office. So in case there's a disruption of communication directly between the wayside and the locomotive can ask the situation from the back office. So it routes it through WSRS, base stations, and so forth. Then you have, of course, the onboard segment. The onboard segment is basically another computer which is situated in the locomotive. It consists of a train management system called the TMC, which is usually in the nose of the engine. And it has a CDU, which is the computer display unit. And that is the interaction, that is for the interaction of the engineer with the PTC part of it. The TMC actually interacts with the braking system, the brake cutout. It interacts with the horn, and it also has a screen which actually shows the engineer what is coming up, what kind of input it needs to provide in order to keep going, or in order not to activate PTC, right? So those are the those are the three segments, and to make them talk to each other is the communication segment. The communication segment mainly has what is called the ITCM, Interoperable Train Control Messaging Server, which acts as a conduit for sending messages back and forth, because remember, no matter whether it's back office, whether it's onboard, or whether it's wayside, these are basically computer units trading messages, reading those messages, and taking the appropriate decision, either rerouting them, terminating them, or processing them, right? So they need some sort of a communication system, and that's what the communication ITCM provides. So think of ITCM as a post office, as I said yesterday, where you write a letter, you address it, you send it. It looks at the letter based on the priority, it routes it, and sends it over to whichever the receiving system is. And this is kind of an overview. You can see that everything is talking to everything else. You have the dispatching system, which in our case is the TMDS. It talks to the back office. It tells the back office what the speed restrictions are, any bulletins, any new bulletins, any forms that it needs to send. It sends it to the back office. Back office immediately sends it on board. Same thing is with the wayside. You can see wayside is directly talking to the locomotive, and I think there should be one more wayside to the back office, which I think is missing, which is a secondary channel. Now BRC is a host railroad, and I'm not sure how many know the difference between the host railroad and tenant railroad. So, read at the back. Take a moment and read through the slide. I don't want to go through each one of them, but I think for our host railroad, basically, there's a whole lot of more requirements that the FRA has in order to be PTC compliant. There's a whole documentation in terms of the implementation plan, PTC IP, which is the implementation plan, the development plan, and most of it PTC SP, which is the safety for the and reporting. Nick, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, from your point of view as students, that, a host railroad would be a class 1. It would be anybody who dispatches their territory, right? Where a tenant is anybody who takes their their train onto somebody else's territory, but doesn't dispatch, right? All they do is they might have the crew and the locomotive. And so as you can see from the list, there's a significant difference between the two. And, one of the things to think of is in the rail industry in the U.S., you know, most of the mileage is obviously eaten up by the Class 1s, and then, you know, what makes us unique is that we have all of the same issues that a Class 1 would have, where a tenant railroad, you know, say like a Chicago South Shore, would just come on to us as a tenant. One of the interesting things for us is that all of the Class 1s are our tenants, which is usually, obviously, in the implementation of PTC, it's been the other way, right? If there was a short line sitting here, they would be talking to you about being a tenant on a Class 1. In our case, we will work with our owners where they're actually a tenant.
All right. So we'll go over a little bit about the methodology for PTC that the BRC has adopted. We had our phase 1 in 2015 and part of 2016, which actually included the conceptual design, gathering requirements, what all needs to be done, scope, what our assets are, what dependencies do we have, what kind of timelines do we have, because our partners are also implementing PTC at the same time, so we had to be very cognizant of that. And at the same time, we started also to engage the vendors that we thought would be able to help us based on their knowledge, based on their standing in the industry, as well as, you know, the things, the methodologies, the tools, and the processes that they bring to the table. And we had finalized Wabtec, Alstom, Onyx. So Wabtec is as a systems integrator, and we'll go over what a system integrator is. Alstom for part of the wayside. Onyx is where our data center resides. So they take care of our hardware so far as the data center is concerned. And then for geographical information systems, we have GIS that actually goes and maps our tracks, figures out where the assets are, where the critical features are, so that a sub-diff file can be created and sent to the boss. So in the second phase, we started to engage the vendors and partners as well, because we had much more intensive exercise to choose for our BOSS Wayside Onboard and ITCM implementations. And then we also needed a systems integrator, because you have all these things going on in parallel. You have all these 4 segments that I talked about here, all the development, testing, and all of that is going in parallel, but at some point it has to come together. Somebody has to make sure that the dependencies are taken care of. Somebody has to make sure that testing activities are coordinated. Somebody has to make sure the priorities are right. Somebody has to make sure that we have all the issues, risks, and all that identified. So in order to bring everything together, we needed to have a systems integrator. Any questions? So, being new to the industry, one of the things that I was interested in is how do we gather information about PTC, because it's in it's kind of siloed, and it's not a lot of people have in-depth knowledge of it because it's so new in the industry. So we have been engaged with we're going to conferences, learning more as the speakers from different railroads have presented. Been engaged with Class 1s and other short line railroads, so to understand what their issues are, what lessons they have learned, where they are in this journey, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes or the same, we don't fall in the same holes that they did. And then also that helped us with determining our own scope, our own understanding, because a lot things like we thought, I thought we had, were things like the supporting tools for change management, supporting tools for document management. Those all, so we are starting to look into those as well, because we realized that we would need them. And then some sort of metrics, some sort of a tool for tracking data, metrics, to see how we were performing, how the system is performing, and because a lot of data is going to be generated. So all of this we gathered from engaging with other railroads, going and attending forums, conferences, and also a lot came out of our discussions with the FRA, because I think this is pretty new to the FRA as well. So it was kind of a lot of great conversations. So the reason behind this slide is that I just wanted to explain that from a FRA perspective or the government perspective, we only needed to equip 2 interlockings with PTC. But we decided that we wanted our entire main track to be PTC because, Nick, you will probably give a reason better than that, because Nick came up with the understanding that this is the wave of the future, and if we are going to do this, we're going to do this right. So, and also, we don't foresee any part of the main track being non-PTC in the future. Since we were laying down this groundwork, we might as well do it all.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened was, you know, when we looked at it from an operational safety perspective, it seemed really not a good idea to have our crews have to make decisions between being PTC or non-PTC. And then what ended up happening is we did a cost analysis project with Wabtec, and we figured out that the bulk of the cost is in the back office, at least in our case, right? Because unlike a Class 1, which has thousands of miles of waysides, we only have 28 miles. So the back office is where the real cost is, and you need the same size back office for 2 interlockings that you do 16. And then wherever you had a Class 1 crossing us as PTC, we would have to put in D-rails, which are expensive. And then also on top of it, you know, the last thing we want to do is lay a train on the ground in Chicago, right? That would not be a fun experience for anybody involved. So we kind of went through that, and then we looked at it internally, and then we felt pretty good about the fact we should go with the entire main line. And then, you know, myself and our GM of transportation at the time, we you know, sat down and talked to the board and really explained kind of the process that we were going to go through. And that's really where we ended up, you know, and we all kind of saw that the future state for Chicago anyway is with everything being PTC equipped. It doesn't make sense to have parts of it. It will only lead to more and more problems if we do that. So we figured that this was kind of our go-forward approach, so that, you know, earlier Anit was talking about how we split it into kind of a design phase and then an implementation phase. So we made this decision prior to that. And then, at least initially, we hadn't done the split between design and implementation. But you can imagine if you're a vendor and you go to them and say, I want you to help me implement PTC, there's so much risk in there that the price was out of this world. And you knew that a lot of that price was just them pricing their risk. So we felt that if we went into it and we split it into a design and implementation, it would be a better way for us to control our costs, which of course are very important to do. And then it also enabled us to kind of buy some time and really understand the design that we would want to implement, and then see what other options were out there. I think, you know, any of you reading about PTC or following it, there's constantly new technology and new vendors and approaches that we can take that are at a lesser cost. And so by doing that, it really set us up, I think, for where we're at today, which is, you know, within the implementation phase. And now there's some new product offerings, I guess, as a result.
So I think we talked about the 2-phase implementation around the discovery, where we gathered the requirements, figured out what the dependencies were, what the timelines were going to be, so that we could understand what kind of talent we need to bring, what kind of capability others need to have. And once that was over, now we are in the implementation phase, where we have started the second phase of actually doing the work.
One of the big things that I guess I didn't build into my timeline was contract negotiations. I know there are some potential vendors online or maybe in the room, but it was one of those things where I don't think any of us really understood how long it was going to take to negotiate out these contracts. For us, you're looking at a contract that is, probably 3 times our normal capital budget per year. So it's a pretty important deal. So you want the contract to be really tight, and you want it to really, not expose you to undue risk. So that was one of the big things. And one of the things that we did, which I think came from my having outside experience, is we went outside and we leveraged other firms. Probably you guys have heard of maybe Gartner, or in our case we used Infotech and Forrester, which are kind of more suited for a smaller company than Gartner is. And they really helped us with those contract negotiations. We were lucky enough to have 2 capable lawyers on staff, but they're not used to doing IT contracts or systems contracts. So we really needed to look outside and get that help. And that's certainly one thing when I talk to other railroads, I always strongly suggest is don't go into this by yourself. There's lots of help out there.
Then we come into some other considerations we had around project planning. So one of the things we learned early on was to involve your Class 1 partners, because a lot of them are way ahead of us. A lot of them have a lot of good information to share in a world where PTC information is kind of comes in spurts and it's not always consistent. It also helps you to be better informed of your vendors, of all the providers. Then the second one is to understand Class 1 timelines so that your timelines kind of match with them. If you're impacted, what dependencies do you have on them? What do they have on you? Third one is to, when you have all your designs, your conceptual designs, your functional designs, your technical designs, to at least have a conversation with them, maybe have them review your designs. Because again, they have put much more resources in this. They have a lot more people who are working on this, and they are ahead of the curve. So it's always beneficial to engage with them. The fourth one is so this is a costly operation, right? This whole implementation is pretty expensive. So leverage Class 1 infrastructure wherever you can. For instance, they have elaborate testing labs. If you can get some testing time, and that's what we were looking for, or have a combined lab, because that makes sense, because these things, while testing, will need a lab, but again, when it comes to lab, I know in a university setting, there are many labs, but when you come in the business, the lab has what? It has infrastructure, it has to have testing scripts, it has to have people who run those testing scripts, it has to have people who have to update those testing scripts. So a lab sometimes might not be sustainable after the implementation. So it's better to go in collaboration than set up your own lab. In many cases, it might make more sense. Then for, as I said, the discovery or the requirements phase, in development life, you have the plan, analyze phase, the design phase, build phase, testing, deploying. So this is part of the requirements gathering phase. Do a lot of work up front. Have an RFP process, which is request for proposal. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So you basically have your, you send it to the vendors reply that what they can do for you and for how much. It's it's a good process, because even if you're going to, who you're going to engage, you should send out the RFP to multiple vendors. And the reason I'm saying this is you get a comparative analysis, and sometimes they will point out the risks that you yourself haven't thought about. So they will give you a lot of input that you can actually utilize on your project. You want to-
Slides about you know, the PTC staffing for the BRC. So if I had come and talked to you guys in probably 2014, we kind of thought that the whole thing would be we would take people like myself, we'd work on PTC, we'd get implemented, and then we'd be we'd sign contracts, support contracts with our vendors, and they would kind of make it happen, right, going forward. In 2015, as we went through the design process, we very quickly realized that that's probably not the way to go, and that we don't need a huge scale operation like a Class 1, but we needed at least some team internally that actually really understood how PTC worked, helped us implement, and that more importantly, it's about after implementation, right? Because PTC becomes railroading. 10, 15 years from now, I'm imagining here at U of I, you'll be teaching it, and it won't be called PTC. It'll just be part of what railroading is. And so, there too, it helped to go and talk to other railroads and see what they were doing. Metrolink out in LA is obviously way ahead because they had to be, right? They actually had to meet 15. So we went out there. We spent a couple days with the Metrolink folks and really saw what they had to add to implement team-wise. Then myself, I went and talked to our FRA side, and they basically said, look, you can sign those contracts with your vendors, but ultimately we're going to hold you guys responsible. You run the railroad, not them. So at that point, we went back to the board and we said, okay, this is at least initially a team, the size of the team we think we need and the different roles. And, to kind of chime back to what Anit was talking about in terms of reviewing your design or approach with your Class 1 partners, we had a big meeting in Chicago where every one of the Class 1s sent 3 or 4 of their top PTC people, and myself and a couple of our vendors literally spent the whole day stepping through all of the decisions and how we wanted to do the design. And then at the end, the big one was talking about the staffing, because I really wanted input from people who are already doing it on what roles were really important versus what roles were kind of nice to have. And so that's where we were at. And then from there, I was able to hire Anit to be our PM. We hired Chris to really focus on the network side and communication side. And then, we're in the process of building out this team. And, in our viewpoint, that team becomes, gets us across implementation, but then eventually, obviously Anit and Chris probably won't do this, but in our other roles, so say our systems engineer who's the wayside expert or the onboard expert, eventually you want those people to then kind of circulate back into the trade. So, you would see the wayside expert suddenly become a managerial person in our wayside department. Same with onboard and the mechanical. And that's kind of the approach that we're taking, at least right now. So yeah, as you can see here, we've got Anit as the PTC PM. We're about to bring on a business systems analyst. A lot of PTC, we need to kind of understand how our current systems work, and then how PTC changes how they need to work. We've got Chris as our comm network. We're going to bring on senior engineers in charge of each of the different areas. And we've actually chosen the operations engineer. We originally thought we would pull a transportation person over. And what we've done is we've kind of taken that transportation person and made them into more of a rules and compliance. And then they can also help us with the operating rules, right, and what needs to change there. So we kind of realized that it's not a full-time gig into PTC, but it's more of a railroad full-time role.
So talking about staffing, so here's my suggestion. If you guys ever come to the belt, my first question would be, what are the 4 segments of PTC? Does anybody remember the 4 segments? All right, repeat after me. Back office. Back office. Wayside. On board. What's the last one? Communications. Good? Oh, sorry, I'm going to drill it. This is again part of the organization with Nick as our Chief Information Officer. Nick, you want to talk anything?
One thing to keep in mind is this is how we did it, right? But other railroads have done it in different ways, and I think it's based on kind of where your leadership and skills are currently, and how you want to build it for the future. So, you know, one of the big things, and I can't remember if we have a slide on this, but I think we do, is that we took an approach where it's by committee, right? So we have a steering committee that is basically the head of each of those areas, right? So equivalently, I, you know, oversee the boss, right, the back office, because it's all IT systems. And so myself, our superintendent of mechanical, our chief engineer, and then our superintendent of transportation, we form the BRC PTC steering committee. I happen to chair it. You know, at some point maybe one of them will chair it, but it was certainly our approach at the time. It felt like that was the right way to go. I had the most experience with these massive systems installations, and that's really what it is. You know, it's a system of systems. And, you know, but depending on your railroad, you'll see different approaches. Oh, look at that. It's next. You know, we felt this was really important to do it this way. Other railroads that we saw that might not have been as successful so far in their implementations might have taken an approach where only one area owned it. We felt like having a steering committee where it was all the affected areas was the best approach. Because, you know, when we have our discussions, sometimes they get, you know, a little heated. But the great thing about it is we each bring a different viewpoint to the table, right? Things that I know, you know, Mark Ferguson, our chief engineer, might not know, but he knows things about the waysides I certainly don't. And so it's really worked out quite well. And then it also helps us to kind of start to make that organizational change, right? It can't be one person pushing this. It's got to be the leadership pushing it. So we think that this approach works.
I think one of the other important things of the steering committee is, like, as a program manager, I can control my project, right? I can control the resources. I can yell at the vendors. But there are certain things in a project like this that are outside of my control that I do not control. And that is when I escalate it to the steering committee, and whether they have to talk to the other railroads or whether they have to talk to the FRA or whether they have to talk to their own departments to make something available for us. That's another thing that the steering committee does. So this basically is, as I've said, is a systems, I feel, is a systems software implementation, right? When we talk about wayside communication and all of that, that's all source code, that's all hardware, that's all messaging back and forth, like you would do it in any network setting. The end result is impacting the railroad, yes, but the underlying principles are the same. So that's why we treat it as a system software implementation, going through all the steps of an SDLC, which is plan, analyze, design, build, test, and deploy. So that's basically the thing. And also that, as any other implementation, it needs to have the right staffing. It has to do, we have to build capability. We have to figure out what our vendors' competencies are. And also, from a safety perspective, how good of a disaster recovery do we have? How do we maintain business continuity? And also operational integrity. Nick?
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to point out with this slide, too, was that a lot of railroads that aren't Class 1s haven't paid a lot of attention to their IT infrastructure. PTC requires it because it's IT-based. You need a good foundation. So that was one of the things that we tried to address early on and started doing about 4 years ago, was, you know, what is disaster recovery? What is business continuity in the minds of our leadership? And then how can we pull it off? you know, those are all really important things, because when you put in PTC, if the underlying infrastructure it runs on stops working, well, then you don't move trains, or you move them in a very restricted way, which obviously in Chicago is a no-go. So those were all things that we kind of, as I described it to our board, was laying a good foundation. We had to build a good foundation first before we put all of this on. And I think it's one of the things that you know, a lot of other railroads haven't necessarily thought of. We hadn't either until we really started to think about how does this really work. And so that was kind of what the meeting here was.
And one of the other things I'd like to point out is you need to have a roadmap. You need to have a strategy and architecture group that would create a roadmap, because everything that you do on your railroad afterwards should be working towards that long-term strategy, right? All the decisions that you make, because IT is going to play, or MIS is going to play a very big role in running the railroads. Then there's some things that I have for program success. You have to ensure good governance on top of the organization structure, so that prompt decisions can be made. Anything that we cannot manage, they manage promptly, but they are the primary stakeholders in this. Nick is the single point of accountability for PTC program. Then you have to have sound functional technical solutions. You need to have program management that has methodologies, that has standardization, that has processes that people adhere to, because there's a lot of information, a lot of documentation, a lot of technical stuff will be coming, which will be needed forever. So I'm going to hurry through this slide because Chris is saying I'm out of time.
So in 2013, we realized we needed to go with a GIS database. We didn't have the skills inside. You know, GIS analysts are hard to come by. So we partnered with a company called Bartlett & West. They developed and maintain our GIS database. They also developed a change management process application for us. So that means basically when you know, when our maintenance away crew is out doing work, they bring a tablet with them, a hardened tablet, and then they're able to update real time where the work is. You know, did they move a mile marker? What's the new you know, GIS information to that marker? And then they're going to work. You know, they've been working with our integrator on creating a subdiv file. We, as I mentioned earlier, we did a bunch of work to start kind of upgrading the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure. And then we really, you know, a really important thing is we began spending a lot of time with our Class 1 partners. We did a lot of trips and a lot of learning. It was certainly information overflow, but it was really good.
I'm going to try to just now, you know, the main points and run through the slide real quick. This is done. You want to go to 2014?
So in 2014, you know, we moved everything over to that hosted environment we mentioned earlier. That was a really big change for us, because then we actually really had disaster recovery after that point, and we were able to really start addressing business continuity. One of the big things that Chris talked about, if you were here yesterday, was the fiber along our entire main line. You know, we obtained board approval and started that project in 2014. And then we ended up selecting Wabtec to be our integrator for the discovery phase. So in 15, we did the discovery phase. It took 10 months. At the end of, so it was like late November, we met with, had all, as I mentioned, all of the Class 1 partners come to Chicago, went through the review, you know, the design, made a few tweaks here and there, but at least then everybody was in agreement with how we wanted to implement, which is really important. And then in 16 is when we started adding, you know, building the staff. We did the implementation RFPs, and there, you know, really it was a lengthy process, a lot longer than we thought it would be. So where are we today? So we started implementing at the beginning of the year. We've been building out our back office system. The ITCM design is completed, and actually Anit and I just finished reviewing it. You know, the project planning is well underway, and then we're really working on that subdiv file creation. I don't know if many of you heard, but it's a lengthy process to get a subdiv that really works. One of the things that we decided to do during the design is only create one subdivision, which is a little bit different. Obviously, Class 1s have many. And then we need to upgrade our current dispatch system to be PTC enabled, which is a pretty big project. And then, you know, we've been talking about change management, document management, and all these things that are, you know, going in, none of us thought that they were going to be such a big deal or a big part of implementing PTC, but they really have turned into them. You need to have all of these back-end processes and systems to support, right? Because anytime you make any change to anything, we need to document it and have it go through a change control process. And for our railroad, that is a completely new experience and has been a fun culture experience.
Since we're already over time, I'm going to want to start. Let me know. Just a few of the lessons learned. Consistency, basically, when I came on board, there weren't any processes. There were any, you know, like races. Races is responsibility, accountability. Who should be consulted and who should be informed. Every activity needs to have that segregation, so that things don't fall through the cracks, thinking this person is going to take care of it, the other person is thinking he will take care of it. So, and I'm demanding that of my vendors, because we have multiple vendors, and you know, you have finger pointing. One, if these are not there, then you have transparency. Everyone knows transparency. You need to communicate where we are at, what issues we are having, what risks we are having. I don't like surprises, so I say everything should be up on out on the table. Again, accountability, we already took care of that. Then you have to have human resources, because actually it's the people who are going to do the work, so you need to engage subject matter experts, because obviously I don't know much about the railroads, so I have to rely on them. So you have to identify who are the subject matter experts who actually know, who are willing to talk, who are willing to share, and so forth. The next one is business requirements. They have to be very succinctly defined. You need to know what you want to be when you grow up, so that you work towards it, right? So similarly with the system, you need to know what exactly you want, and timelines. So requirements are a big, because it's the foundation of all projects. Organization change management, because there will be redistribution of responsibilities at times. There will be addition of responsibilities, change in processes, because right now everything is being manual. Suddenly you're putting in PTC. Bulletins are showing up on your onboard electronically instead of somebody handing you or calling you. So all these changes have to be accounted for. You have to have a process design that says this is as is and this is to be, right? If you don't know your as is, chances are you'll fail on your to be. And you might need to engage human resources if there's significant redistribution of responsibilities for the resources. Change in skill set. Knowledge management. Knowledge management basically is a lot of documentation, a lot of FRA documentation, a lot of compliance documentation, a lot of design technical documentation in terms of from your requirements to your functional designs to your technical designs to your testing records to your testing scripts, that all have to be put somewhere in a logical way that you can access it later, because PTC is ongoing. There is no end date to PTC, because after this you'll be doing upgrades, you'll be doing enhancements, or you'll be doing break fixes. You will need that documentation. We already talked about engaging Class 1s. Invest in the team. So Nick is big on investing in the team, getting them up to speed. Even people who are not on the team, we encourage them to attend forums. We encourage them to go to conferences or go to training to get some trainings. Then PTC, as we have about 5 vendors, so that's why we call them partners. So we have to manage them. We have to make sure that wherever there is a transition of an activity from one partner to another, that there is an ironclad handshake, right? So that people are not pointing to things go south. Nick already talked about the infrastructure, and we talked about supporting tools that we now realize that we need, and the need for reliability and redundancy. Nick, you want to add anything?
I just think, you know, the PTC has no end date is a really important thing for everybody to kind of soak in. You know, when we first started this journey, we really kind of thought of it as a project that we would implement and then move on, like a lot of other things we've done in the past. And it really isn't. It changes your railroad, and that's how you function going forward. And, you know, because it's a systems of systems, well, it's going to have a lot of change forever. And that is, you know, a scary proposition, but also one that, frankly, we all deal with in our daily lives, right? Our phone, everybody in here has a smartphone, I'm pretty sure. And that smartphone updates on a daily basis. Some part of it updates, and we roll with it, right? Well, for us as railroaders, we're not really used to that change, and that's really what this will happen, you know, is bringing. And so that's why those things like change management and document management, incident management become a lot more important. And, you know, for us in our railroad, it's also been that kind of transparency across what used to be silos, say, between your engineering department and your transportation department and your mechanical. They really have to be broken down in order for us to do this well.
So remember the segments I talked about? Good. So I didn't want you to repeat it, but that's great. I was just making a point. All those 4 segments actually are basically computers, and or processors, right? So every one of them has. So you're talking about millions of switches, billions of signals, back office itself. All of them are computers, basically. All the computers, what do they have? They have an operating system, they have a database, and they have an application. Somewhere, some point in time, all the time, something is going to be upgraded. So that's why PTC has no end date or enhanced.
So we included this last slide just to kind of give you guys all an idea that there are things industry-wide that are going on, especially you know, to try to help non-Class 1 railroads really adopt PTC. So the Short Line Association, we created an executive PTC task force, which I sit on. And our mission and goal is to work to find appropriate PTC services for tenant railroads. You know, many short lines are maybe $2 million in revenue. They don't have anybody who can really work on or you know, easily understand or go out and find what they need to do. So that's what we're trying to do there. We've worked a lot with the PTC vendors that currently exist on this hosted concept. So you know, currently there are three vendors that provide a hosted, mainly CI BOSS service that a tenant railroad can sign up for. It gives them the ability to be PTC equipped pretty quickly. You know, they share in those 3 vendors then participate in the kind of Tier 1 architecture of ITCM, and therefore can communicate to the Class 1s and people like Metro or Amtrak. You know, there's the hosted CAD concept. You know, we had our dispatch system physically located on site. We kind of about 2 years ago pushed to have a real DR site in our hosted environment, which was in West Chicago. And recently we actually had to fail over and use it. So it's now our primary, and we're building a secondary hosted site out in Indianapolis. And if you look at some of the vendors, that's what they're going to start selling going forward, because it makes sense. Why would you have this infrastructure locally? None of us are IT companies in that sense, right? And even IT companies don't host their own data centers anymore. You know, there's testing as a service, and then, you know, there's a concept that's being worked on by the AAR and TTCI of this shared service PTC lab, you know, for the railroads, and that's something that, you know, the Class 1s are excited about. I'm very excited about. I know Lou Sanders, who represents kind of the APTA, so the, you know, commuters and whatnot, we're all excited. You know, it's a long-term project. It's something that we're not going to see, you know, too soon. But I think in the long term, there's a lot of value in that. So yeah, as you can see, contact info. So anybody who gets the slides, feel free to contact us any point, anytime.
Questions, comments, remarks, suggestions?
Yeah, we definitely have time for questions.
Yeah, my real job here happens to be in IT here at the university, so I'm really nosy. As far as the hosted solutions, I mean, we're well on our way to taking advantage of all sorts of, you know, cloud vendors and shifting a lot of our on-campus data centers to the cloud as well. But I mean, I'm just curious, like, what kind of service level agreements you guys have with that, with respect to making this part of what would be a vital operations to your railroad?
So in most cases, so if you went and you go with the hosted solution, they're what we would call, or, you know, as an IT person, we call a private cloud. So they're not all the way out to, say, Azure or AWS. And then, you know, in our case, it's to 5 nines is usually the SLA agreement. You know, what we've had to do there, though, is we had to take, in our case, we took Wabtec, which is a, you know, a provider of application and then also hardware for PTC, and we took them and we partnered them with Onyx Managed Services, which is a data center operator and out of actually Canada, and then we put them together and said, hey, you guys got to work together to come up with a hosted solution, and that's kind of where we've gone with them.
And a quick follow-up to that, too. I mean, you certainly highlighted the PTC part of it, but was it built as an overlay on the existing IT structure, particularly with the computer-aided dispatching, or is it?
So we've kind of tried to keep them a little bit separate. You know, one of the goals I have, and kind of how I talk about it in our railroad, is let's address and change our, you know, create our business processes around what we need to do for PTC, but let's put it in a way where the IT solution itself, which is really what the back office is, or CAD, we can plug and play it, just like you would want to do with your ERP system if you could, right? A lot of ERP systems make it hard to do that, but that way that as technology changes and as the options out there change, we don't have to change the business in order to change the IT solution. And so that's really been our approach. So that's why I've tried to keep them separate, because if I overlaid and, say, use that same private cloud, well, then I'm kind of tied, right? And so that's why we've tried to, you know, it might be in the same data center, but I want them as separate, separate clouds.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple of quick questions. What's the price tag? How much is this costing? And secondly, on your locomotive fleet, for maximum flexibility, are you equipping all of your locomotives or just dedicated ones?
So that's a good question both ways. I can't give you an exact number, but I can tell you, as I mentioned earlier, it's, you know, it's 3 times our annual capital cost on the capital side. On the operational side, which is actually the scarier one, if you ask me, right? Because our operational cost of doing business is, say, here today. When we're done with PTC, it's here. It doesn't come back, right? Where the capital cost is kind of spent and gone, and we can move the capital and spend it elsewhere. So from an operational expense side, it's a significant bump of, I don't know, it's probably about 30% bump It's a big deal. And then, you know, I know we have some of our owners in here and online. Well, how do you recoup that cost becomes a big issue and something that we've been working on internally with them. In terms of our locomotives, we, as you saw, we have 29, but we only decided to equip 5 because for us, PTC is really about the owners. It's not really about us. We have very few jobs that run on the main line. So we only need 5 locomotives, or at least that's what we initially think we need. And that should give us the redundancy that we need to serve those industry jobs. But if they don't, we'll add a couple more. You know, for the belt as a host, equipping a locomotive is a cheap thing compared to the other stuff. Now, if you're a tenant railroad, it's still a significant expense.
Thank you.
So something I realized I hadn't asked before is, what is your current train control system? Are you all CTC? Or?
Yeah, so we're all CTC. We run Wabtec's TMDS system today. You know, as Anit was mentioning, you know, we need to PTC enable it or upgrade it. So we're in that process. And frankly, we put that in about 5.5, 6 years ago. And we certainly didn't take the same approach to that we are now. So we didn't really document what we wanted. You know, it was that, hey, we have this current system, we want the same thing as that system, which all of us who are, I think, engineers and IT people know that that's a nightmare, right? You're never going to get what you had before, plus you really don't actually want exactly what you had before. So it created this situation where we have an implementation that we're semi-happy with, but there's still a lot of tweaks that need to be made in order to be fully PTC equipped.
So is the PTC system going to be an overlay on the CTC, or is it going to be standalone vital?
So it'll be an overlay. It's currently non-vital. Obviously, we all have the goal of someday of it being vital, but for now it'll be, you know, non-vital.
I read that Congress is making PTC like a requirement for track. So for the Class 1s, I imagine it wouldn't be that big of a problem in terms of economics or financial, but like what about the short lines? What does that mean?
So I think if any of the Class 1s could speak right now, they'd tell you it is a big problem economically.
Well, then what about the short
lines? But for a short line railroad, it's a huge deal, right? If you look at us, you know, there aren't that many host railroads that are short lines, right? So you've got your 7 Class 1s, and then there's about 17 other railroads. Now on the tenants, you know, so in our case, it's a big deal. You know, but we have a different setup, right? We're owned by most of the Class 1s. But for a short line that is a tenant, it's still a big deal. You know, I think most short line railroads thought all they had to do was equip their locomotive and they were good to go. But in reality, you need that CI boss as the back end that Anit was talking about. So you have your crew and consist. And 3-4 years ago, the only option to do that was to stand it up in your own data center. And due to all of the kind of SLA requirements to it and redundancy requirements, it was a really significant infrastructure cost. And then most short lines, of course, probably don't have a data center, and they certainly don't have a data center staff. We didn't, which is part of why we shut it down 4 years ago and went to a managed hosting provider. So that's why over time we've worked with the industry to create these hosted solutions. And, you know, it's been twofold. You know, a lot of the Class 1s have pushed the industry, you know, the vendors to provide this because they identified this huge kind of risk point. And then from our viewpoint, too, we've really pushed and tried to work with the vendors to create that hosted solution that is hopefully at a more reasonable cost to a tenant railroad. But it's still significant. You know, you're still looking at it, you know, close to, you know, over $500,000 a year for a tenant railroad. That's a big deal.
Yeah, so I was intrigued by your comment about you know, the cell phone updates all the time, and thinking kind of how PTC is never ending. What does that actually look like in terms of, you know, the software testing that you have to do? It's easier to test something physical when it comes to kind of verifying that the intersection of all these back-end systems, the diff checkers and everything is working properly?
So that's where the, you know, Anit was talking about labs. So that's where your lab becomes a key critical component. And what makes me excited about the shared, kind of a shared lab in the future is that, more importantly, it means shared test cases, right? So that we're not all doubling, tripling that hill every time and creating new test cases. But yes, there's a huge component to that for a host railroad. Now, for a tenant railroad, the testing anytime there's a change should be less onerous. You know, the industry as a whole is kind of, you know, we've got a kind of a committee that sits on top of all of this, right, that's going to make decisions on major changes and how frequently they occur to try to mitigate some of that constant change and constant testing. But it's going to be to me, that's the really interesting part going forward.
Especially when you have so many systems talking to each other, right? But I think the ITCM will at some point mitigate some of that, because so long as you can send the message to ITCM, right, you don't have to get the others. So to an extent, but still you'll still have to, there will be certain other systems that you will have to involve in testing. But it will become this.
All right, we'll get to the online questions here really quickly. First one's coming from our good friends up at NICD. How are they planning on doing their federated connections?
So the federated connection is going to work this way. The belt will be considered a Tier 2, and the Tier 1 in our case is WabTech. So those 3 hosted services providers will be the Tier 1 connection into the ITCM network, and then anybody who signs up with them will then be considered a Tier 2.
So by the way, the federated network is where your railroad will communicate with the fourth railroad.
Okay, another question from Mike Garcia. To what extent has the FRA and the Illinois Commerce Commission been involved in your implementation plan?
So the FRA has been intimately involved. Illinois Commerce Commission, not at all.
And finally, from one of our former PhD students at the University of New Mexico, is there a way for researchers to access the data collected by PTC? This is more about the accessibility of the data from the outside.
I think that'll be all to each railroad, right? I mean, we came here today or yesterday, and we spent a great morning with you guys learning about the research you're doing, and a lot of the research ties to things that I want to do at our railroad going forward. So I think you'll end up with partnerships between, you know, universities or research institutes and railroads that are willing and want to share.
It's a great answer from our standpoint. All right, I know we're running late here, so we'll thank our speakers once again for taking the time to present to us.
Thanks for having us.